And you
Can everybody see my screen?
Yep.
Alrighty.
Thanks. Did you guys get a memo? Follow each other? Of course. Didn't you?
I did.
Blew it. Sorry.
Okay, Mark. Go
So, Jeff introduced this as RESTful APIs, but I kind of wanted to take a step back and just talk generally about APIs. So, in general, an API, the application programming interface, is just simply a language and message format used by software for communication. So we use these things all the time, just inside of day-to-day programming. But the big one that we really talk about is this one, where there's a client and a server, and the API is the thing that connects the two of them. And we spend a lot of time talking about each one of those the client and the server pieces. I think we spend less time really talking about the actual API and how that is put together. A lot of things end up getting assumed, and that's not really a good systematic plan. So the reason when I started thinking about the APIs, I wanted to kind of encapsulate that kind of problem, or what I see as the necessity of APIs, and what this talk is really about. And kind of came up with this big blurb: was the quality of the API used in a web application has immediate and prolonged effects on the quality of life of both the web application itself and the developers working with that web app. So to break that down, the quality of the API has immediate effects. So if you have a good API, there's a lot of good immediate effects. It makes feature development quicker, which makes more features able to be done in a single sprint. The end cost for the client goes down, all those good things. If you have a bad API, it increases all those costs immediately. Sometimes even before a project gets off the ground. If we're doing an RFP, but the API is not structured well, we could have increased costs and not even win the bid because it's going to cost too much. Whereas if there is a well-defined API already in place when we went to bid on a project, we would have reduced costs, and maybe that's going to get us some work that we wouldn't automatically get or otherwise get. Then there's the prolonged effects. So APIs are not forever, but they last a really, really long time. It's a hard thing to get rid of because they touch, that API touches both the client side and the server side. It's not just that you can update one side of it. You have to update both sides, and that's just really expensive. That's a large refactoring, or even worse, an entire rewrite. So APIs tend to stick around. If you have a public API, which most of our software is not, a lot of our software is private, so-called private property, where it's not out necessarily public-facing. It's inside of a company. But if you have a public API, that stuff kind of is forever because you have to be backwards compatible. So there's long-term effects. A good decision on an API in the beginning, or a bad decision, that's going to last for a very long time. And since it has effects on both the client and the server side, it has a big effect on the quality of the application on both sides of the fence, but also the developers that are working with it. Development goes a lot faster and a lot easier when people are not so frustrated with an API they want to smash things. That really brings down morale and makes the effort a lot harder. Whereas if you have an API that's really simple to work with, that increases the communication, not just as far as the web app is concerned between the client and server, but better communication between server-side developers and client-side developers. It makes their lives so much easier. So thinking of that, if we want that quality, we have to come up with some kind of systematic approach to APIs, because if we do it once, that's great. If we do it once, great on one application that we build for one client, that's obviously a win. But the real win is to be able to replicate that over and over and over again for all of our clients. So to that end, I was trying to think of what makes a great API. And that list obviously had to be pretty short. So I came up with 3 different things. I think 3 things that if an API fits these 3 points, it would be a great API. The first one is that it has high-level theory supported by technology leaders. And that's basically saying on a very high level that somebody that has a big name has published something about it. It's not an unknown. There's documentation around it. Now, the more documentation and the more, the bigger names that you have as far as these technology leaders, be it a company or an individual person, that leads a lot when we have to go talk to a client towards credibility for this theory. So when we show up, personally, I don't have a PhD, so if I can take papers written by people with a PhD and give that to a client as some kind of justification for a design idea that I have, that lends that PhD level credibility to that idea. Now, obviously you can't just steal it. You have to give credit where credit's due, but really giving that credit to those people is what's getting you that credibility, because they have the name that goes with it. So the other part of that is all of that high-level theory by those leaders. These are the kind of guys that like to sit down and write white papers and dissertations and long, verbose blog posts about big, high-level theory stuff. Now, you might not, I personally don't even understand a lot of the stuff that these guys are talking about, because it is very deep, but it has that documentation. So with that copious amounts of documentation, it's something that we can give to a client to prove the point. So the second part is that it's also supported by peers within Unicon. And I think this is important for a lot of different reasons. One, if nobody else inside of Unicon thinks that your API design is a good idea, then it's probably not a good idea. There has to be somebody else that's going to back you up and to say, yes, this is a good plan. But also, and I think more importantly, resources change throughout projects. So to have just one theory with one person isn't going to work. You have to have have to be able to bring in different resources onto projects and move that idea across multiple projects. People get moved to get other staffing, they change jobs, they have babies, all that stuff where you have to have plan B with another person. So if one architect is out or one developer is out, you have to be able to bring somebody in to fill in for that. And a lot of times, especially with some of this architectural stuff, I think the client needs to see more than one person in some cases. If they're hesitant about making a decision, either because they're just not sure, or they don't have a lot of experience making these kind of calls, being able to bring in multiple resources from Unicon to kind of hold their hand and make them feel good about an idea is really, really helpful. So there's the theory, and then there's the support. The last part is that it's the best of breed. So whatever idea, whatever theory, on a high level, the implementation should be the goal of having the best implementation possible of that particular theory. So that comes in with, there's a lot of ways when dealing with not just APIs, but with all kinds of issues within software, to take shortcuts. So we have to just knock out, we can't do the shortcuts. It has to be the best of whatever that theory generally is. So with those 3 things, we can pick a lot of different types of APIs. So it's not just one specific theory. There's new stuff coming up all the time, so it doesn't necessarily need to just be a tried and true type of pattern. It could be something totally new, but if it still has that high-level support inside of Unicon, and we can do it in the best way possible, I think it can still be a great API. So to that end, I started looking around at all of the different kinds of structures of APIs. But in the end, I did come back to, in general, I came to REST. So a REST API, generally. Now, one of the things when looking into this and looking at REST is that REST is very large. It's a large concept, and it's kind of a moving target. It's very ambiguous. There is no definition to REST. So when someone says REST, a RESTful API, what are they actually meaning depends on who you're talking to. There's a lot of different opinions on what REST actually is. So to that end, to try to get something more specifically, I think to meet those top 3 standards for what a great API is, a specific definition would be a strict RESTful design that meets level 3 criteria on Richardson's maturity model and implements HADOS following a well-defined standard.
HADOS, all right.
Yes.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, I have that all the time.
to go through this part, the strict RESTful design. Now, strict can mean different things. It's kind of a subjective term. Inside of REST, there is this subculture of folks called Restafarians, and I did not come up with that. And these people have read Roy Fielding's dissertation and chapters 5 and 6, and they might have tattoos with it on them because they are absolutely dogmatic about the implementations of REST. If it's not in the original document, it doesn't exist. And I think that that's way too strict, to the point of being detrimental. I think it's counterproductive. But still, you can't just have everybody just kind of do whatever approach to things. So there is some strictness, but I think that's up to the interpretation of the people that are trying to use this as a guide. So that meeting level 3 on the Richardson's maturity model. So this guy named Richardson came up with a model that helped define these levels of REST, and there are 4 levels. The level 3 being the highest. Because as a good developer, he starts his arrays with 0. So
I was like, where's that 4th one?
Yeah. So level 3 being the top level, and that's the reason that we're choosing level 3 is because there is no level 4. If there was level 4, that would be the best of breed, and that's what we would choose. So it's the top level, and part of that top level in that model is implementing HADOS, and there's a lot of dislike for that acronym. I think it's awesome. It makes me think of some kind of Norwegian death metal band. And part of that and I'll get into HADOS specifically later, but following a well-defined standard. So if we're going to implement this thing, we're going to do it, somebody has to have written down a standard with some decent instructions. We can't just wing it. That's not a good systematic plan to just come up with something new each time. So to break that down very specifically, we'll start off about what is REST. And the definition of REST is REST stands for Representational State Transfer. It was a term coined by Roy Fielding in the year 00 in his dissertation, Architectural Styles and the Design of Network-Based Software Architectures. Like I said, specifically chapters 5 and 6 deal with REST. So if you want to go look up that dissertation and you just want to learn about REST, skip to chapters 5 and 6. Reading the whole thing, it's not a very long read. It's not exactly a page turner. So if you're a little bit tired, you probably want to choose a different book because it can tend to put you to sleep. But it does have some really good information and gives a good background to the person who truly coined REST. So you can start at the beginning. The architecture is loosely or abstractly based on how the World Wide Web works. So it should be familiar. When you read about it, it's not some totally new thing. And lastly, it's a style, not a standard or specification. So you can't just get the book on how to do REST. There's not a bullet-pointed list on how to do it. It's everybody's got an opinion, and there will not be a standard for the foreseeable future because people are continuing to fight about it. But we have implementations to do, so we need to put something together. So in REST, there are several different these tenets of REST. These things have to be there for something to be a RESTful API. And the first one is that it's a client-server setup. And all that really means is the client does client things and the server does server things, and they don't kind of muck about in each other's business. Meaning that the server is not going to be sending back markup with style tags wrapped around it. Or determining, what color buttons are. That's a client realm, and at the same time, the client doesn't care what database the server is using, or operating system, or any of that stuff. They're two different separate entities. The second one on this list is that it's stateless, and that just points to the fact that this was developed by a server-side developer. Because in our world, it is the exact opposite. It's very stateful. The server is not going to maintain state. We have to. In fact, we have spent a lot of time with a lot of code to maintain that state. That's what a lot of our frameworks do, is capturing that state. The third one is that it's cacheable, and that's cacheable on the client side as well as cacheable on the server side. That cache can also be invalidated and be forced to update the cache. Fourth is that it's a layered system, and this is another point when you read about it that you'll see that it was designed with server-side developers in mind. It talks about the various layers of the server component, but at the same time it could have just as many layers to the client component. There's nothing saying that when a call is made that the end point, the end of that return to that call, or the client that's making that call is the client that's going to be, in the end, receiving the data. And the last point, which I marked as important, is uniform interface. And the uniform interface is, in my opinion, after reading all this stuff, that's where the REST has, a lot of implementations of REST go from RESTful to REST-ish. They don't fit the grade because they don't meet all of those criteria that are under uniform interface, which I'll get to. The last one is code on demand, which is optional. And that just means that some of the return data can be actual executable code. It's a little scary. I haven't dug too much into that on why or when that would happen. But since it is optional, I'm just going to kind of ignore it for now. So to go into more in this uniform interface. So into the uniform interface, there's resources are modeled separately from how they are returned to the client. And I think in a lot of cases we do this. This is kind of inherent, where we're going to ask for data in either JSON or XML, and it's being stored in a MySQL database. We're not going to get a big chunk of SQL code back. We're going to get the end product. Now, that isn't always necessarily true if we're using Mongo and we're storing JSON and then we're returning JSON. But there still should be that hook inside of the setup on the server where it could be transformed into XML. It doesn't necessarily need to be built to be transformed into XML, but the architecture should have the option to be able to plug in that functionality that's necessary. The next piece is that the resources returned to the client contain all of the information necessary to perform the CRUD operations on those resources. So if you need anything that is necessary for to do a post, to create a new entity, or to read a list of entities or to update them. All of that information is there. You don't have to make separate calls to get all the information to fill out a form. It's all inside of one item. Third thing is they contain all the information, not just on to do the operation, but it contains information on how to do the operation. So all of the list of parameters on a post that is necessary to create a new entity. Not only does it give you all of the information, but it tells you what those required items are. And then the last one is that resources provide actions and links to other resources and processes of the API, and that is HADOS, hypermedia as the engine of application state. So in a lot of ways, by implementing that HADOS, that is doing a lot of the work of maintaining state for us, not so much in a database or inside of actual code, but just inside of the API itself. So, which is a pretty big win for us. So that goes on to the Richardson's maturity model. And that starts with the swamp of POX on level 0. And POX stands for plain old XML. And in that type of setup, this, if you think way back in the day, this would be everything's a post. You make a post to the server, and it returns some XML. And you just keep doing that over and over and over again. There's nothing changes. Second one, that's when you get a little more sophisticated, and it comes in with the idea of resources. So you might make a post to different endpoints, not with different commands, but you actually have different endpoints that you're going to try to hit, but you're still making posts, and it's only posts, and you're just still getting back some plain data. Level 2 is the implementation of HTTP verbs. So in that case, you're going to start to transition and hitting those endpoints with a get, a post, put, delete, patch, or any of the other verbs. And the last one is the hypermedia controls. And that one is you still have your endpoints, you're still using your verbs, but now you're adding in linked data to other areas of the API. And that is the highest level currently of REST. So the next part with HADOS, getting more in detail, because we have to come up with a standard for it. I've listed 3 here. There's JSON LD, JSON HAL, and Siren. There's many, many more. There are really, I was actually kind of surprised at how many there are out there. And my end feeling is that they are all generally not very good. Sad to say. It's not that the structures aren't very good, that the ideas aren't very good. It's that the documentation is just terrible. And really, with these kind of specifications, it all is documentation. There really isn't any code. There could be code with supporting libraries, but the main part is having the documentation so everybody knows what's going on. Pretty much the largest one is JSON LD. That one gets a lot of points, some points in my book, just because it is published on W3C, which is brutal to read because it's that W3C website, which has no style sheet or a terrible style sheet. So it's really hard to get through, but it does have a lot of information on it. The examples and samples on the JSON LD site are not very well done. So it does need a little bit of help, but JSON LD was the standard that was chosen by LTI for LTI 2.0. And since we do a lot of LTI work, it kind of seems to me where if I was going to have to pick one, that JSON LD would probably be the forerunner, just from talking to a client and having that LTI story behind it. JSON HAL and Siren are both, I would say, about equal. They don't have as much verbosity as JSON LD. They don't do as many things, which means they're a little bit simpler, and sometimes I think that's better. but I think that's a little bit up in the air, as long as it's a good standard. If you go to the site and it's a standard that's being kept up with, being actively worked on, then I think it would qualify under that well-defined standard, as long as everybody can share the documentation and have a good understanding of how that structure is going to be, because it is so critical to the API. The design portion. So now that you have all the different bits, you actually have to put it all together. And there's 3 points here. There's web API design, crafting interfaces that developers love, by Brian Malloy. He's from Apogee. And it's, I think, like a 27-page PDF, really well put together. There's pictures in it and stuff, so it's not all reading. Really good ideas from him. I think I'm going to steal a lot of them, because it's just his thought process I really agreed with, in that if you have an API that developers love to work with, that their work will be a lot more efficient. So he kind of centers on that idea, and definitely worth reading. Like I said, it's not very long. A little bit more depth is thoughts on RESTful API design, lessons learned from designing Red Hat Enterprise Virtualization by Geert Janssen, who might be part of the Hados Norwegian death metal band. So that has a lot more depth to it. It's general high-level stuff. It has good information. The last one is the Atlassian REST API design guidelines. That one is less of a theoretical how-to. It's just their REST API design guidelines, but it's really slick on a lot of different levels. One, instead of telling you the theory behind an implementation, it's actually showing an implementation. It does give a little bit of information on why they did certain things, but it's less about the why and more about the how. But also just seeing how they put together their documentation. If every application that I worked on, especially like a legacy app, because you're just stuck with whatever that API is, if it at least came with this kind of documentation, it would just make life a whole lot easier. It's really well put together, something that we should probably aspire to copy, because it is so well done. When you have to read, how does this work? I think it works well for both server-side and client-side developers. Next part, documentation tooling. I didn't find anything that I thought was any good. There's a few things. There's something by Apogee called Console, and it worked okay. You have to come up with these weird WAML files, so you have to write XML for some reason, and you either have to pull down their tooling, or run it from their website, which I don't want to put. A lot of times we'd be constricted where we couldn't put an API, private API up on their website and things like that. So that one, I liked how it worked, but just wasn't a really good solution. There's another one called IODocs, a little less features than the Apogee console. Still, it is open source, but I wasn't thrilled with it. I didn't think that it really cut it as something that this is how as an example of how to document an API. Really, the Atlassian documentation was the best API documentation that I could find, which was done, obviously, they used their Confluence model because they build Confluence. So I think it's down to that right now. I didn't really see much that would be some kind of auto magic, write the API and it just spits out documentation that works. That's yet to be found. If anybody knows of anything, that would be a good find.
Tech writer. Hire a tech writer.
What was that?
I think you have to hire a tech writer.
Yeah, yeah, I think it really is that at this point. So, sample time. So, going through all these concepts, first I'm using this Chrome plugin called Postman. I don't like that it's a Chrome plugin. That's my only complaint with this plugin, is that it's a plugin. And click the "Do you agree" button. It says it wants access to all your websites, and so I continually turn it on and turn it off and disable it. So it'd be better if it was outside of just the browser. But otherwise, this is a pretty handy little tool. So I have a very simple API set up on localhost at port 3000. I am hitting an endpoint called users. If you go through a lot of the design documents, you will find endpoints being named as nouns, and basically only nouns, and plural nouns. So you're not going to have an endpoint such as user. It would always be plural. So to do that, we're going to run a get on that users, and I find out that I have a class. The endpoint that I've reached, the data coming back, is a class of users. One of the properties is a total, which has 0. There are no entities in it, but I get this cool thing called actions. So if I knew nothing about this API and I just knew that I could hit API version 1 users and run a get on it, pretty much all of these endpoints would have a high-level get, and that's how you're going to obtain the information to get to the next step. So I can see that I can do a post to this, and I can post a username, first name, last name, and email. So if I go to here and I change that over to a post, so I fill in my post data and click send, and I get a return. On that return, I can see that I have an object, a class of user. So it's a single entity. It has properties for first name, last name, username, email, and an ID. No sub-entities, but I also get a whole bunch of other actions. So I can create, it gives me the ability to create another user right there, with all of the form fields that I would need and what their type is. I can also see that I can read the user by running a get with supplying an ID. I can delete the user, and it gives me the full URL that I need to do that. I don't have to guess at where I'm pointing to. And this could be a fully qualified URL, such as this with the HTTP localhost, or it could be a relative URL. But it's not necessarily pointing to a root inside of the UI. It's pointing on the API. So it's not something that's going to go into the up into the address bar. It's something that you can be consumed programmatically. The last one is an update, a put. So now I see the fields that I need when I run a put. Lastly, I get a set of links which gives me itself. So I have a link to itself. Now I can go back to see my general list of users, and I see I have a total of 1. And now that list contains an entity, and that one entity is the entry that I created. So it still has the post that can be done. Now I can go back in. If I wanted to update that, I can select that item and then run a put. And let's see. So now I want to change that entry. When I click send on the put, this does come back with data. Now, so there are some folks that say that puts should not return data. that puts and deletes should be just returning blank. That's not necessarily a hard and fast rule. So in this case, returning that data returns the next step. And so in my opinion, I feel that it's important to return something because it did create a record. So if it updates that record, it should have some return data. Now I can go back to my general list and see that I did update my database with Johnny Cash. Now I can go in if I wanted to delete that record, get the record, and it tells me exactly how to delete it. I simply need to call a delete just on this on that endpoint, and now I can see this returns 204 no content. Come back, and my list is empty. Now this structure is using the Siren standard. It's a little bit, like I said, it's a little bit simpler than the JSON LD, but I think it does also contains everything necessary. I'm not sure if it would contain everything that somebody would want. One of the things, and I create a new post. And so in here, you'll see this link inside of this entity, and it's a embedded entity. So instead of having a link such as to the actual record itself, I'm actually embedding the properties of first name, last name, email, and username. Now this relative link, this rel link, is not relative, it's relation. So this is a class of user. Well, what is a user? What does this API say that a user is? This would then be filled out with the documentation that describes in long form what a user is. In a lot of cases, you try to keep the nouns, obviously, or something that is human readable. But in cases where things can get cryptic, everything would come with these rel links. Now, in JSON LD, they take that to the nth degree. I mean, everything has a link outside to be able to define and document what that item actually is. Regardless of how it's named, it's attached and tied to a specific piece of documentation. So I could see on very large APIs, which even if the API is very large, you'll still likely have a short amount of endpoints, but they can chain together. And part of that is with these sub-entities. So down through these entities, I could have other entities underneath this user. And that could, so in the concept of, say an LMS, you could have a user that is linked to a class. That class is linked to a course. That course is linked to an assessment. That assessment is linked to various assessment questions. And all of that can be chained together just through the API itself, leading as you go. So when you get the user, you would have sub-entities of classes and be able to find that through the API based on the links that are sent. That's really that power of that HADOS implementation, where you're not guessing. It also allows for very easy upgrades. So if something needed to be patched, let's say you wanted to move something out to another version, the only thing that changes is the link that's coming back, because it's always calling this href to get itself. So if that updates to version 2, or if we wanted to...
So you mean like... Sorry.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
But so instead of in your client or whatever, hard-coding the API to V1, you would be responding to these hrefs dynamically so that you'd automatically get to update.
Correct. So instead of having an API where you have to look at the documentation and think a lot more about what you need to provide, if you looked at this put, you can pull in your endpoint. It's already formatted, and if this, let's say we wanted to upgrade this one to version 2 or version 1.1 because there was a bug for some reason, it also tells you what form fields are necessary. These are all the required fields. So there's a lot of, you can determine a lot just from the API that comes back what needs to happen.
So another question, I don't know if you're going to get into this, but is there something, I assume this is a node server, is there something that's like automatically doing formatting your output this way?
No. This is, I'm not going to show you the code because it'll make your eyes bleed.
So this is really hard to do.
Yeah, this is big JSON chunk that I then did some very hackish parsing to add in like these API, these IDs, things like that. There's not a framework behind it. There is a framework called Percolator that I messed around with it. I don't think it's mature enough as far as like a Node.js implementation. It's a great idea though. There might be, depending on other programming languages on the server side, there might be, more libraries out there.
So another question.
Okay.
What do you think about the verbosity of these responses, especially with like mobile and stuff? I feel like normally we tend to only send like what you have in the properties section. All this extra data seems kind of bulky.
I think it's a good thing, actually. And my internet connection is utter crap. I mean, like, you guys have better mobile phone connections than my main house internet connection. And this kind of stuff does not hurt the connection. It's really just text. And the biggest thing is as far as data is movies and people not optimizing images. The not optimizing images is a huge pet peeve of mine as somebody on a third world country style internet. Those little thumbnails that are 1.2 megs just drag. So it's actually saving on the chattiness because I'm really only having to make one API call to do a lot of different things. I would rather pull down, a large-ish, this is, let's see if it'll tell me how big this is. Oh, I can probably get it from network. So, what does it say? So this is 2 kilobytes. I mean, it's not, which is not small when you think of, what it's actually displaying. But one of the things is, when developing the API, I think one of the important things is to try to shoot for performance issues, actually. Where when you're first starting off, this get will that's getting the users will get every single user in the database. There just happens to only be one. But if there were 10,000, it's going to try to return all of them, which is going to be a performance issue. But if all it is a performance issue, there's the easy way to fix that is by simply filtering the call. Whereas if it doesn't have the information that's necessary, if you're trying to write some logic and the API doesn't have it, then you have to try to make another API call. Or talk to the server-side developer, say, oh, hey, I need the username on that call, and then have them do something. That amount of time and energy, I think, is more detrimental than the performance issue, because the performance issue has known solutions. Trimming these things down can easily be done, and that's a lot. I think that might be that that level 4 of the Richardson's maturity model is when this HADOS approach, when you reach the size of Facebook and Twitter, and you have to start, you're doing so much volume that your distributed global network comes to a halt unless you update your APIs and the amount of data in it. Until that point, I don't think it impacts negatively, and if it does, it can certainly be solved.
Yeah, in the grand scheme of things, the additional stuff that's added to this is nothing compared to just the sheer amount of entities. That's what's going to add the most, right?
What do you mean?
Well, like in the case of 10,000 records, that's going to be big compared
you would
to.
never send 10,000 records to the client.
Right. I'm just saying, agreeing that this doesn't add that terribly much compared to the amount of data that just adding 30 more records
would be
exponential. But like, in a scenario where every single byte is critical, it seems like you might not be able to choose this type of setup.
Wouldn't it be exponential because for each record you're adding in the actions block, which is going to have.
No, there's an entities block and then there's an actions block.
Okay, but if you scroll down, so there's if you're pulling up users,
Mm-hmm.
I guess you wouldn't have the actions block for each user in the main list.
No,
because the actions are, the way that works is, one easy thing to do is, instead of this properties, you can actually remove this and change it to just a link. So if you have let's say this was something, not just a user, or maybe it was a user, but instead of just these few properties, it had, hundreds, arrays of stuff, just run a ton of data. You could just swap that out with a link to have that data. This would be, if you're doing a user list, you'd want first name, last name, username, email, possibly. But you also have the link as well for more properties. This can be defined, as you're using it, which properties should come back on the large list, but all of the properties would come back when you get that specific entity.
Oh, is that like a siren specific type thing, I guess?
They all have their own way of kind of handling that, as far as what gets linked and what gets embedded. So they're all fairly flexible, or at least and when I say all, I mean the JSON LD, JSON Wall, and Siren. They all have some flexibility in how that's going to be implemented. They're not rigid in all the properties must be listed all of the time. There's a lot of things like this rel, this relational link, that has to be present. So those kind of things, but it's really pretty small. The actual list of actions only comes in on the specific item. That's where your actions list is probably going to be the biggest, because, but right here, it's still only 4. You might have more actions, because one of the other, you can create your own verbs, essentially. So instead of just doing a get, post, put, delete, to use the assessment analogy, if this was an assessment entity, there could be a new verb, endpoint that would be a score. So it's an action. You're going to score that assessment. That's not necessarily for, in the terms of an assessment, it has to be done on the server just for security reasons, because the client always lies. So, those can be added. So that list will get fairly long, but still it's like 50 lines of JSON. It's not, it wouldn't be monumental, and it can always be trimmed. You know, you can break things out and put them in smaller pieces if necessary.
So I guess what I'm wondering is if you have like a list of users, so for, I'll say user list, and you have like a delete button. So that would be an action you want to perform from that list. Would you make a call to the individual user to get the delete action, and then make a call to that action? So you'd be making 2 calls?
On this, you
Wait, that up right now.
delete that entity. Yes, you get the delete from that entity. Now, whether you cache that or not and manipulate that, how that's handled is, you don't necessarily need to make a call and just get this. That could be, you can make assumptions on it. So there's nothing inside of the API and or inside of REST that really dictates what you must do as far as, if I know that this is the path to delete a user and this is just the ID at the end, I can save that.
Well, I guess the only difference would be if the method changed, so with your custom verb or whatever, you wouldn't know what that would be. Mm-hmm. So that would be, at least by doing it and requesting the individual and then getting the actions from that, you'd be getting updated methods or whatever. Yeah. I'm just asking, because I looked at the rally that is being used before they switched over to Jira, and it seemed like Rally was using something like this, but they were like, every entry had like 20 actions. So you'd have 100 items that had 20 actions in each one. So, and the file did get very bloated at that point. So that's why I'm curious. I didn't know what was kind of the recommendation or whatever.
Yeah, it's some of these formats, some of the HADOS formats are extreme. Some of them are more strict than others. But it is kind of open-ended. Just because it's using a well-defined standard, it doesn't mean you cannot misuse a well-defined standard. So it's, I think in the end, though, with, having something defined, a lot of this stuff, whether you choose to use all the features or not, it at least gives a really good starting point, for, and for a lot of this, I haven't put this into practice. So what pain have I hit on this? Really none. I've just done it for a presentation. So, trying to come to an understanding of what works, what doesn't, there's really only one way to get that information. That's to do it. So, in my mind, it's worth exploring. And I can't think of a better way, as opposed to this. To meet those 3 criteria, it is implementing some version of HADOS, and I think that's I think it's necessary.
It's just pretty crazy. I guess that's why I can't think of a time where I've ever been beyond level 2. Yeah.
Yeah. That's the thing is, one, I didn't even know this existed, and I was around in 2000. So, just I've never done this, and it's very well thought out by people that know a lot more about this than I do, and also even looking at the people that I've talked to inside of Unicon, that peer support, those guys know more about this stuff than I do. So I'm really just copying in a way, taking what they know and relying on them, because I know they have good judgment on it. I think at this point it's up to the implementation portion, and see how that goes. But I think we kind of, in a lot of ways, we shoot ourselves in the foot, when around APIs because, I've been doing this for a long time, and every single API is different. And it doesn't seem to make a lot of sense because if you do it one way that works, a good way, and if it's the best way, then it's the best way all the time until something new comes along, obviously. But it should be repeated. We not starting from scratch on every single project, just because it takes too long. And I think a lot of this, if it's a defined structure, I mean, we can get a lot of wins just by, we know there's going to be a user's endpoint. There's basically always a user's endpoint. And a lot of others, like classes and courses and assessments and the stuff that we deal with every single day, and most of the apps that we write, we can start nailing those things down. And some of the properties might change. In one app, they might want to capture social media credentials on the user and other maybe a driver's license number or something. But in the end, the general structure is always the same. And I think that saves a lot of time and gives us the ability to tool towards a particular implementation.
Have you found any Angular stuff that's designed for consuming any of these Hados things?
Not specific to Angular, but just looking at all of the the setups follow this very general high level kind of structure. It's I think would be, if we picked one, I think would be pretty trivial to write a few services that handled some of the more generic parts of it, because it's really not that deep for most of them in terms of all the JSON that's involved.
So maybe it just hasn't become that popular. I mean, I'm like you. This is the first I've even heard of any of this stuff.
Yeah, and
not prior that I had a pretty good handle on it. How to do RESTful.
I think a lot of it's to implement something like this is more difficult. I mean,
there's
like Mark was saying,
a single library out here to transform your output so that you don't have to.
I'm sure there are.
And craft your response.
I'm sure there are in some of your languages like PHP and Java and stuff. I'm sure there's packages out there.
I know
that for Node.
I'm surprised nothing for Node because
JSON LD does have a JavaScript library, but it's not an Angular specific. And I haven't played around with it enough to know. I downloaded it. I didn't really even touch it, so I have no idea if it's any good or not. But the specifications are very detailed. In the case of JSON LD, there's a lot of words around it, but it's not very big. There's just some high-level concepts that need to, once you understand them, I think the coding of a library would be fairly straightforward. And like I said, I think that if I had to pick one, that's the one that.
You did have to pick one for the demo, and you picked Siren. So what are you telling me here, Mark?
I'm telling you that Gary Gilbert gave the presentation on LTI 2.0 too recently for me to change.
Okay.
and JSON LD is not quick and easy. That is one thing I think it does. Since there are some more rules around this, people can't just play as fast and loose with the API of, in terms of projects. When you're developing an endpoint, it has to match. It has to follow the structures. So I think it's going to take longer on the initial, to come up with, to have something match all of these rules. But I think it wins in the end, as far as time. Because once the pattern's down, it's the same exact pattern for every single endpoint. It's just getting that first one that I think is would take longer.
It is very intriguing to me, and I'm just trying to think how I would hate my life if I had to manually code every endpoint. So I don't know if there's something for Express, but if not, we should write one.
Well, you could do something on Mongoose, which is
Like I said, that percolator,
kind of a schema.
it has percolator. It's not built on Connector Express, so it's not a document server. It can't serve files. It only serves JSON APIs. But it was way too buggy for me. So I think there does need to be a library in Express to write this stuff. But because it's JSON, I mean, that's a lot I think a lot easier for us than some other languages.
Yeah, no, I mean like automatically generating the URLs. I would want to say, you know, here's my noun, and you just do the rest.
Yeah.
Because I mean, if it's going to follow the same structure, then it should be easily reproducible, which sounds like, done right, you could make, you know, API, altering the API could be a lot easier if you just say, you know, app.endpoint users, and it automatically spits out all the things you need. You know, you have to base it off some kind of model, like Ryan was saying, you could use Mongoose for the model itself about what are the required fields and that sort of thing. But then you'd have to tell Express, you know, v1/users, put post, delete, patch, whatever, all those various endpoints. I'm sure at some point you have to do some manual tweaking, and there's custom actions and things like that, but definitely sounds like, oddly enough, since it's been around since 2000, seems like there's a lot of work to get this going, that somebody, you know, even if it's in another language, it seems like, well, we could just port that over to Node or, you know, whatever. I just find it weird that it's so difficult, but I haven't looked into it, so maybe it's not as difficult as I think.
Yeah, I don't see it as a, you know, I don't think it's a big deal. I mean, it definitely needs work to be able to generate, you know, shortcuts for all this stuff, but I don't, because a lot of it is very static. It's not scary to me. You know, I think it would be fairly simple to create the tools around it. And I do think that, you know, recently, you know, I think one of the reasons we haven't heard about this, you know, this is, you know, I really only started looking into this, you know, for about a month. And, you know, it's really only recently that the client side has enough technology, you know, outside of, you know, Flash was good, it could maintain state very well. But now with the frameworks that are out there and the client being able to truly maintain the state and really process this stuff, now I think it's both sides are ready. The client and the server both have the technology needed to truly implement REST, you know, fully. And I think it was missing a lot of that. You know, the Web 2.0 stuff, just the browsers weren't there or JavaScript wasn't there, you know, in the past to be able to pull this off in a real way, you know, without, you know, being too much on the bleeding edge, where you could take it to a client and say, you know, we can build this today, you know, we can get started right away.
Yeah. It also kind of reminds me of like SOAP. Because you kind of, I mean, that wasn't going to the client being a browser, but it was, you know, you often would have two servers that communicate because your API is distributed somehow. And so all the WSDL stuff you would get, okay, tell me via XSD what's a user and that sort of thing. So this, and especially the verbosity, maybe just reminds me of the old days of SOAP transactions and how verbose XML can be. But I mean, so it's just kind of funny because JavaScript is, and JSON is devoid of schema, but with like Mongoose and this, it's like we're always trying to get to something more strict.
Yeah. I think the strictness helps, personally. It's, you know,
Yeah, it does.
everything in line when bad things start to happen. So let's see. That was pretty much, you know, at the end. I had, you know, my conclusion was that I think this is the way to go. You know, one of the downsides is we don't actually implement APIs. You know, we consume them, but we don't implement the web services. So it's really
I want to be a node.
hopefully, you know, we do more of those implementations. But in the end, I think it's going to require, you know, some pushback. And for me personally, you know, I'm open to all ideas, but it's really, for me, it has to meet those three things. It has to have good documentation. Has to have good theory behind it. It has to have support from other peers in Unicon, and has to be done, you know, to the best of its ability, whatever that implementation is. You know, even if it's not REST, but if it is REST, you know, if that's what somebody says they want to do, then we should do REST, but we should go all the way and do it the right way. You know, do it fully, and you know, that might take you know, some discussions, and you know, with the other side of the crew, you know, on the server side, getting some of those guys involved to help push that idea more throughout Unicon. Just, it'd be nice to have, you know, some standardization, you know, like we've been trying to do with you know, different frameworks, or even, you know, how we run Jira, you know, things like that. Where if we standardize some things, it makes everybody's life a lot easier, which is, you know, really kind of an end goal. If we can make the same amount of money for easier work, everybody wins. So, and then I found this. This is just, I just thought this was funny, so I added it at the end. But it's very reminiscent, I think, to a lot of us. So, any other questions, comments, points of discussion?
Well, at risk of talking about the bench project, I do find this interesting, and since obviously the bench is too much for us to handle on our side projects, I think that this might be something you may be trying out, just a few, you know, demo frameworks, try out Siren or JSON-LD. Creating repos in Bitbucket might be some more doable learning things. So if you want to, you should put your demo app on the Bitbucket, I guess, a comment. The only way to make it more of like something that Unicon does and more of a standards is if we actually do it and become experts in it and try it out and find out where some pain points are. And it's difficult to do, especially when we don't have any clients necessarily asking us specifically to do it. And, you know, so.
Well, I think it's, you know, it's just a matter of, you know, the next project that I'm on that has to use an API and you know, it's not already, that API doesn't exist, we're going to use this. Yeah, you know, that's.
I don't know, Mark. Enjoy your confidence.
I don't know, Mark. I really enjoy the API we're currently using.
Oh yeah, you know, single letter variables inside of an API is
AID. Yes.
Q. Just
QID.
Not even QID, just the letter Q. So, yeah, But I think it's just
An
user.
outside wrapper that has the status of 200, and the inside wrapper of the response, which has the real status of 400. That's sexy. Just saying.
So you can speak well towards the pain of the quality of life difference between a bad API and a good API.
Yeah, it takes like an extra week to build anything because you're like, oh, I need to parse the hell out of that because I don't have time to fix the API. Or, oh, I'm getting back capital letters, all caps for properties and lowercase. And in this API over here, it says course ID with an underscore, and this API over here says class ID, but they're the same thing. Oh, awesome. That makes me feel good.
We have a little bit of that
Yeah.
sprinkled out throughout client E.
Yeah.
I tend to think it has to be thorough.
Part of it.
I don't know. If one person's responsible for writing it, in the case of application X that I'm speaking of, one person really was, and I don't know what they were smoking, because if they were the only ones building it, why would they name something here with underscores and over there with capital letters? Like, it just feels weird to me.
And sometimes it's not even a matter of one person doing it, it's just a matter of all back-end developers doing it. For
So there's
example,
back-end
where there's
developers.
UI developers not involved in designing an endpoint.
Yeah. I know.
Which is, I think we have to get out of that. I think we have to be involved. An API is one that affects both sides. We're just as responsible.
No, I know. I'm just griping.
Yeah, but it's if we have to, I personally will not eat at McDonald's because I don't consider it food. So I'm not going to consume an API that I don't think is good. I think we have that, that ability to just say, no, we're not doing it.
And imagine if we actually could standardize, right? If we could standardize on a front end and a back end. Man, imagine we get a brand new project, we spin it up, and we got most of the app, at least the core basics done, right? That'd be amazing. Every app has like a user, some sort of user interaction, right? It always has the same login type stuff typically. It'd be great if we could standardize on that stuff. All right, Mark, get to work and let us know when it's done.
I mean, that's what that thing, Jeff, the back-end maker thing. What was the name of that? Jeff Cross's project. Deploy kind of tries to help with that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Here's a user's, and here you define the model this way, and you're always doing the same thing over and over. It's tough to even standardize on front end, back end, and even the API.
But
to the degree that you need to.
No, I agree. And some of it is conceptual, right? Some of it is high level conceptual, right? So we have sort of pseudo standardized on Angular and sort of like an Angular stack, and even to a degree an Angular sort of structure when we're talking about modules, right? And there's some variances.
Well, that's
right?
why there can't be a standard. It always has to be.
It's like a conceptual standard.
A group consensus of best practices.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah, I would agree.
Yeah, and I mean a lot of it, like just because the endpoint, you have the user's endpoint, the properties that those users hold can change. But I mean, if you're going to have any kind of authentication, which almost all of our apps do, I can't really think of one that doesn't. You're going to have users. So if it at least starts there and gives here's how we're going to wrap the endpoints, and maybe starts with one or two, really generic ones. That's that at least gets apart from the how are we going to send the data back and forth.
I don't think it's so important that you have a user's entity. There are some times where you're writing an API that doesn't have users; they're handled by something else. But I do agree that having some sort of, if we're gonna pick Siren, for example, doing all this and having a standard way, and then the client UI can have a expected way to deal with it, so it doesn't matter what the entity is, it can figure that out from the API programmatically. So I do, that's what's most interesting, I think, to me about this.
Hey, Mark, I was curious what your, or what I guess anybody in the room's impression of node uptake is amongst customers. If you're finding much traction in getting that toehold where you can start not being slave to the other back-end people.
Well,
Actually,
I can tell you that client P is very receptive.
Yeah.
Yes. And they,
yes,
we've already started building some things in Node.
got to go to a meeting with the CTO of Client P, and not for the I gave the recommendation for one of the projects that I built for them. He told me that they are using not just Node but also Cassandra. Seemed to be something instead of Mongo, but they seemed he seemed very interested in the technology where applicable.
I think that most clients are excited about what Node can offer. Honestly, you bring it up. I think a lot of them are like they're dipping their toe in the water, so to speak, right? But Node, in my opinion, is still dangerous to implement in a production setting because it's just not, the tools just aren't as mature, right? So say if you want to build something super mature, Java has been around for eons, and there's just so many best practices to use. It's just got, there's several ways to do it right and do it right. Node, it's like there's not a lot of debugging, and so what we actually need for Node, I think I was talking to Ben and Mark about this, is if you, just like we've got Angular for the front end, we need like an Angular for the back end, an all-encompassing way to do back-end development. Give me a framework that does it, and don't let me piecemeal things together, because that's when you get the Wild West of JavaScript, right? And so like I would love
like Spring,
almost like a Spring for the back end is what I would love to see. I mean, me personally, right? That's what I would like to see it mature to, but. I think that clients want to use it for the benefit that if it becomes mature enough, now you solve all of your resource problems by hiring the plethora of JavaScript devs and converting back-end devs to use JavaScript. Now you've got your costs, in a way, go down, and you don't have to worry about this. This guy had this programming experience. That guy over there got that programming experience. It's like if you get some front-end guys and some back-end guys, you can cross-train a lot easier on JavaScript, and you don't have to,
I don't know. I'm not sure that it's purely the developer resources.
No, I think that they see it as a benefit.
Yeah, I think that, to me, I'd see the major development benefit is being able to have developers take ownership of a feature entirely. So if I'm going to do the class list feature, not only do I write my class list client-side code, but I also can write all of the endpoints necessary with all of the data and do the database work to make the class list function.
I don't see that really as being node specific. It's more of a microservices philosophy.
Yeah.
Because in the end, if the project is big enough, you're going to have, you're not going to have that many people that are going to take it all the way from CSS to deploying in AWS. You're going to have a team of people. You're going to have a team of people who are like me, I know JavaScript, I can do lots of heavy JavaScript, but I'm not really that great at styling things. I leave that to other people who are. And it doesn't matter that I know JavaScript and I could do all the range of it, but it's going to be a team. So I don't think that's specific to Node. You can do that with anything.
And back to your point about the frameworks and stuff with Node, every time I've tried to use an MVC or anything beyond Express, it's felt completely bloated and unnecessary.
Well,
I
that's
think
because we haven't gotten it right yet.
Following design patterns
Yeah.
is the most important thing, which is there's design patterns that work for ActionScript, JavaScript,
Yeah.
Java, .NET, all of them. It makes sense to use the exact same design patterns.
I would just say that, I remember when we didn't have Angular and the front end felt like it could get unwieldy quickly. And I would say that Angular brought balance to the force, so to speak.
Node's kind of in itself. I mean, it's got the common JS module pattern, which is
Not
really what we're getting out of.
It does, but okay, I'll give you an
Yeah,
example.
organizing folder structure is one thing, but that's
I guess I'm looking for, all right, so I guess I would like a framework to tell me where to put stuff. Tell me, because like if you open up a Node file, right, and you're not used to back-end setup, it can be like, well, what the heck is middleware, right? And go try to find a definition of what middleware is in the context of Node. It's not exactly easy. Or where do I put my body parser? It's just like, it's difficult.
You're not talking about Node, you're talking about Express.
I'm just talking about frameworks in general.
It's a framework,
and setting them up,
generator,
right?
It makes all these folders and tells you exactly what to put.
Right. Whereas, I know that the learning curve to Angular is relatively high, but I'm saying if someone were to make like a Spring-based type of an MVC pattern for the backend for Node, and it was mature enough, had a lot of debugging tools, okay, and it had a lot of examples, and a lot, it was widely used, gained adoption. I feel like it could bring order and structure, because right now, Node, in my opinion, is a lot like when we use Backbone, right? Now, if I write a Backbone application, it's Matt's special Backbone app, okay? It's my special framework. It's my flavor of the month. Same thing can happen with Node.
It can. I don't know. I think that it's already going to be piecemeal. Even Spring, I mean, you don't use only Spring stuff. You want to be able to switch out your different backend. Maybe there's a Spring adapter for it.
Yeah. Well, listen, I'm just using Spring as an example.
For example, you've got Express, and that's your web framework.
Yeah.
Maybe it's not. Oh, it doesn't have to be. You could easily do more of the cowboy style and just do straight up HTTP. And then you've got, well, maybe you're using Mongo, so you use something like Mongoose, or there's other ones you can just use straight.
Yeah. Listen, I'm saying what I want. Okay. What I want is to be told what to do when it comes to Node and the back end, and I want a company to like Mongo backed MongoDB, obviously, right? There's a big company behind that, pushing it forward, making it better. I want a company to say, Node is my beat, and I'm going to make it awesome so that it is awesome for everyone. Just like Google took front end and made a framework that kicks ass. I want the same thing to happen with Node.
Are there any other players in the I guess the server-side JavaScript space like what's that framework? Meteor.
That was on that front end.
Strong Loop. There's the company called Strong Loop that took over the Express project.
Yeah.
They have their own. They have their front end, which was Strong Loop, and then they have a back end called Strong Ops. That's a management for the Node Express magic.
Yeah, it's actually built similarly to Deploy because Richie is at Strong Loop. And that's what they hired him for. Yeah, I would say Strong Loop is the closest thing you're going to get to that. They officially support Node as an enterprise software.
Which isn't exactly, I mean...
They have their own version of Node as well.
Yeah, they're not a big name. They're certainly not a Google. But
No,
they
they're
don't
definitely not
have
as
to.
big of a name as...
They don't have to be Google,
You're
but
searching for something that's never going to exist.
I think you're wrong. I
mean, there's always going to be. There might be something that a lot of people have a fairly strong opinion is great.
Yeah, and that's all I want.
But you're never going to get this is what you should do.
Okay, well, all right. Let me. All right.
You're not.
Man, you
it's not
really
just know that
read
you're talking
into
about.
every
You're talking
word I
about
say.
All
I swear.
of the software design.
Because that's how you roll.
I speak in approximations. Like I don't mean to be black and white. I want framework. Not everyone thinks Angular is the bee's knees, but I think it's awesome, and I love using it. I want the same feeling around a backend technology that is JavaScript based. I guess I'll say it like that.
Therein lies that's what I get from Mark. Is he's just like, damn it, I'm tired of Rails and all this other crap coming down from these other places. I want to do it JavaScript. That to me is what it's coming down to. It's like,
Yeah.
I kind of care, even if you have to fight the same problems. Like somebody said, talking about like how there's this kind of like formalization of what was once the wild west JSON. Now there's stuff like JSON schema now, which is like, oh, that's okay. The XML people are like shaking their head like, oh, we've already done all this. So yeah, it's the same thing, but it's just like it just feels better. It feels like that warm blanket in JavaScript instead of this thing called Java or Ruby or whatever.
Well, I mean, the barrier to getting in. I mean, so look, one of the the barrier to getting an application. If I had a race, if you sat next to me and right next to me right now, I said, now let's start up an app. Ready, set, go. I would be done in minutes. Where with Java stacks, it's just like, oh, I need this jar, I need this file, and this library. Oh, I don't have the right JDK. And it's just like.
Well, that's not a really great example. It's going to be npm install this.
All right,
I've seen hackers for you guys, and it's believe me, it's like internet.com.
It's not. And you're talking. What you're talking about is speed of spinning up two apps. The fact that they build theirs.
Yeah. Yes.
It's just the time of compiling. That's all.
Well,
there are trade-offs there too.
I prefer moving away. I got nothing against Java. I have nothing against Java, and I actually think that Groovy on Rails is a nice way to develop. I mean, what's that?
It's just like when you talk about it, you talk like you're a child.
Java?
But when it's npm install, okay, yeah, so we need this dependency. Oh, maybe.
This is a safe
What's
place.
an hour?
My point being is that I have had more headaches working on a Java stack trying to get stuff to work in general than I've ever had on a sort of node-based structure, right? So anytime I've been working and I've been able to control, I just have an API that I'm hitting, whether it's remote or it's local on my box. As long as I'm spinning up Node, I'm proxying things, never have a problem, right? And I spin up quick, never get blocked. The minute you walk into the world of and I'm generalizing here, but Java, it can get blocking. It can, be difficult sometimes to set up. It can feel like it takes forever to get an environment going, and I need specialized knowledge from person X, Y, or Z. And I just don't seem to have those issues when it's JavaScript based.
I think the big difference there, Matt.
Yeah.
Documentation. To me, it doesn't, like, if it's Java, but there is 87 simple steps to set up. I don't care if it's 87 as long as they're all detailed and I can just run through all of them and get my environment set up. It's the lack of documentation or the need to some implied knowledge of those server-side technologies.
Yeah.
For me to know, which version of PHP do I need? I don't want any version of PHP. So I don't know how to distinguish. To me, they all kind of suck. So I can't make that decision. But if somebody says you need to have PHP XY, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and here's how to install it, copy and paste this into a terminal window, and it'll magically happen. Great, that's fine. To me, that's fine. It's when it's the README just says README. I can't do anything with that because I'm not being a server-side developer. I don't necessarily know the different breadth of technology. It's not just one technology that's being used on the server. It's a whole different ones. Whereas we pretty much work in JavaScript, HTML, and CSS. It might be different frameworks, but primarily all JavaScript. So
I think what you're experiencing is more that Java has been around forever in comparison to Node. And so there's a lot less stuff on GitHub for Java. But you go to GitHub and there's readmes and people care, it takes time, but nobody's going to go back and write documentation for some old Java library that's 10 years old. And everybody who's been working with Java forever knows exactly how to use it because they've been using it for the past 10 years, banging their head against the desk, figuring it out, telling each other. Because the internet was, I guess, wider a long time ago.
90-something.
2 years ago.
Back in 94.
Yeah.
Back in 04.
That was a while ago.
Here's another question.
The Program album's 20 years old.
Who's done something synchronous against a data store, let's say, just SQL or something like that, a synchronous SQL driver in Node? Has anyone done that? Because I have not.
Talking about transactions?
Just something synchronous, just something that's not the async model.
Well, I think that I've never seen that. It's always asynchronous.
Yeah. So this might be a stupid question.
I mean, there's ways to have.
There's drivers out there for the like SQL databases and stuff like that.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
there's MySQL. I don't know about Oracle.
Because that to me is when you start because I guess one of the underlying motivations I had for asking the question about deployment of Node or uptake amongst the clients was when you start saying, okay, well, oh, by the way, you've got to change your entire persistence thing. Oh, by the way, it's with Mongo, which is also on, or Cassandra or whatever. And, you tell that to a big customer with a pile of Oracle or something like that. If server-side JavaScript can't do that, or it's in beta, or it's buggy stuff, or community support stuff it's late.
I don't think it's there yet.
I can't think of any. I haven't really looked, but I can't think of any Oracle stuff. And I highly doubt if there is anything. It's probably
I can't imagine the JavaScript developer that also knows Oracle. Because that is a skill set. So I think part of it, as far as like Node's concerned, is because Node it almost can't do as much. It doesn't have those frameworks. You kind of simplify the server-side components. I think you move more of the logic out to the API into the client side. There should be less processing on the server.
The client always lies.
What was that?
You said the client always lies.
Well, yeah, you can't trust the client. Trust but verify.
There's with Node, at least you can do C++ modules, so maybe there's an Oracle C++ driver that has or could be adapted that would have.
Yeah. I just don't know.
It would more just be like adding script hooks to access it, and that would probably have the robustness and maturity.
When I worked at another client in Denver, they built an entire sort of social component that I was a part of. It was all built off Node, and I can't tell you how many times it stopped working in production. It crashed, and it was very difficult to find the bottlenecks. It was very difficult to find where is it failing, because they just the reporting, and this was like 2 years ago. The reporting wasn't there. The bugging tools weren't there. I don't even know if it's still up and running, that piece. I don't know if they switched it or not. I just remember reading. The back end. It was all Node, and it was messy. It was really hard to figure out where things were. Once you were in your correct, area, So one thing I liked about it is I was able to jump in and write my own endpoints, right? And that actually helped out sort of the system architects, right? Because they didn't have to worry about that. They're like, okay, here's the spot where you write your stuff, and then they were working around the surrounding areas. So It did help in that respect, but it was still fraught with problems.
It's definitely an immature. I mean, it's not even 1.0 yet.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. But I see things going that way eventually.
yeah, I mean everything's moving fast, and lots of people are jumping on board, and it's not going to be banks for a while.
No. No, as we were talking earlier, no, people care too much about that money to have it running on Node.
On even the recent stuff that they've been dipping their toe in the water with is like the discussion service. It's not critical data.
Yeah.
And they're still learning. They don't know. Like one of the biggest questions is like, yes, we put together the app quickly, but they have no idea how to deploy it, scale it, all that stuff. They got to figure it all out.
Yeah, I don't think Node and Mongo and all that. I don't think it's right for everything, right? We had a client where they drank the Kool-Aid and they absolutely wanted Node and they wanted Mongo, and it wasn't right for what they were doing. And we told them that ahead of time, and it came to time to deploy. They were in production. Now we talked them out of Node, but they still wanted the NoSQL. And it was dropping transactions like, I don't even know, add your funny acronym there or funny statement there. It was dropping a lot. And they were coming back to us like, what's going on? Like, Mongo can't handle it. That's what's going on. And so we had to switch the entire thing to MySQL. But I mean, that was just a ton of money.
It's that whole right tool for the job,
Yeah.
I see a lot of use for Node in two areas. One, for a lot of the smaller stuff that we end up doing, like a lot of simulation work, where it's very one-offy, but it might not be like a large piece, like an LMS or something like that. It's a little chunk of content, but also as a kind of a first pass. Like I said, if you get a new project to the point of performance issues, I think you've won, because that means people are using it, and so the client is going to have some justification to spend more money on it. And if the only thing that's failing is performance, it's just slow, then it's worth the refactoring or the update to the server-side component to make that faster. But it's for those proof of concepts, because Node is so lightweight and so easy to get set up. It might not have all of the error checking and all the real robust stuff for production, but to at least get something off the ground to prove out an idea, I think it's cheaper to do that in Node than it would be to say in Java.
It probably just depends. I'm not sure. That's true.
Does Heroku support Node now? Does Heroku do?
Yeah, I think they're pretty much based on Node.
I know they do Ruby, of course. They have a voice themselves.
They're doing a lot more now, I think.
In terms of rapid search, I think Ruby is hype up for sure.
Yeah, they're doing Java, Ruby, Node, PHP, Python.
Cool.
I think that's good for.
Node Jitsu is pretty cool.
Yeah,
That's a specific node. It's like Heroku, but it's specific for Node.
Okay. Any other discussion points?
No. Don't get me wrong. I love Node. I love JavaScript.
Yes.
I'm not mad at you.
No.
It's okay, you can hug it out.
I didn't take offense.
No, I know. That was
Okay.
for myself.
Oh.
Because I just been talking like, it's not what you think.
This JavaScript is just a fad. This whole internet's going to go away.
So, hey Mark, are they going to let you re-implement Novex in Node? Call it Nodex.
Nodex.
Okay. Well, thanks, Mark, for presenting.
All right.
And I guess that's it. So, everybody have a good afternoon.
All right. Talk to you guys later.
Later, Mark.